As former President Donald Trump reintroduces sweeping tariffs on European Union, EU goods, diplomatic tensions and economic uncertainty have surged across the Atlantic.
European leaders are denouncing the move as an aggressive and unilateral attack that risks not only their economies, but the very foundations of the international trade order.
With Trump planning to impose 20% tariffs on major EU exports, the global trade landscape faces yet another seismic shift. How EU countries are reacting, their vulnerabilities, the geopolitical and economic stakes, and the possible retaliation paths Europe could pursue. In this turbulent scenario, we assess whether the EU will bite back or whether it will wait, calculate, and hope for a U-turn. In his return to economic nationalism, Donald Trump has unveiled new 20% tariffs targeting EU exports. This move has triggered a storm of criticism from Europe. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz called it fundamentally wrong. Spanish Prime Minister Pedro Sánchez labeled it a unilateral attack. French President Emmanuel Macron described the tariffs as brutal and unfounded, warning of their massive impact. Trump argues the tariffs are necessary to correct a long-standing trade imbalance. The EU exports far more to the US in goods than it imports. In 2024 alone, the EU enjoyed a $200 billion surplus. But Europe counters that services tell a different story. The US runs a surplus there. The new tariffs will hit sectors at the heart of European economies. France wine, champagne, and aerospace. Germany automobiles. Italy luxury fashion and goods. EU overall machinery, chemicals, and high-end consumer products. These industries form the backbone of European exports and jobs, making the tariffs an existential threat. France has taken a leading role in countering the Trump administration's tariff campaign. Emmanuel Macron has convened emergency meetings with business leaders and urged them not to invest in the US until the situation is clarified. What message would we send by investing billions in the American economy while being hit by unfair taxes? Macron asked. Macron's comments hint at a broader EU sentiment, strategic caution mixed with economic defensiveness.
But despite the tough rhetoric, there's internal division on how to respond. Some countries advocate immediate retaliation. Others prefer negotiation.
Some EU countries are far more exposed than others. Ireland, one of the most vulnerable, with exports to the US making up 20% of GDP.
Much of this is in pharmaceuticals and tech, currently exempt from tariffs. Germany has over 5% of its GDP tied to US exports, particularly in automotive and machinery.
France, Italy, Spain. Varying degrees of exposure, from 2% to 4% of GDP. Luxembourg, Cyprus, Malta. Highly dependent on services exported to the US. The impact isn't just economic. Trump's move threatens to fracture the internal unity of the EU, as each member state weighs its national interests. Beyond traditional industries, some surprising sectors are at risk. One such example is French cognac.
While it's often stereotyped as an old-fashioned drink in Europe, it plays a significant role in American pop culture.
Popularized by hip-hop icons like Jay-Z, 50 Cent, and Snoop Dogg, French brandy has a cult following in the US. Over 40% of France's brandy exports head to America. Tariffs on these products won't just hit European producers. They'll affect cultural connections and consumer preferences. Spain's olive oil and gas turbines are also in the crosshairs. These niche sectors exemplify how deep and nuanced the transatlantic trade relationship has become. The European Commission is now faced with a tightrope walk. It must show strength to its citizens and businesses while avoiding a full-scale trade war with the United States. President Ursula von der Leyen insists the EU holds many cards. The EU represents 22% of global GDP. The single market has 450 million consumers. Von der Leyen argues that the EU has the economic clout to retaliate. But retaliation brings risks.
Big tech showdown. Targeting Apple, Meta, Amazon, and Elon Musk's X platform could draw fierce American political and legal responses.
Energy dependencies. The EU is now heavily reliant on US.
Liquefied natural gas, LNG, after shifting away from Russian energy post-Ukraine invasion.
Retaliating in energy would hurt Europe more than it would hurt the US. Defense ties and Ukraine. Any major transatlantic rupture could hinder NATO operations and support for Ukraine. Maro Sefcovic, the EU's trade commissioner, says talks are underway with the US. The plan is to stall direct retaliation and push for diplomatic solutions. Brussels hopes Trump can be persuaded to negotiate or even reverse course. That's a tall order. The Trump administration has made it clear no country can negotiate its way out before the tariffs take effect. Still, the EU could offer Trump incentives. Buying more US LNG purchasing, more American military equipment, easing tariffs and quotas on US agricultural goods. But these moves come with internal contradictions. For example, the EU has promised to strengthen its own arms industry, a direct conflict with buying American defense gear. European officials warn that Trump's actions risk unraveling the international trading system. If every country retaliates or adjusts policies to survive, chaos could ensue. A major concern is China, facing 50% tariffs from the US.
China may flood Europe with cheaper exports, seeking alternative markets.
In response, the EU might have to raise its own tariffs on Chinese goods, sparking a secondary trade war.
How do you price in the collapse of the global trade system? One EU official asked.
In this environment, even internal EU inefficiencies become liabilities.
The IMF estimates internal barriers among EU member states, like varying tax regimes, are equivalent to 45% tariffs in manufacturing and 110% in services. That's worse than what Trump is imposing.
For now, the EU seems more inclined to strengthen its own systems, reducing internal market barriers, boosting intra-European trade, enhancing digital regulations, increasing independence in defense and tech. Yet none of this solves the immediate crisis.
If Trump remains firm, and if the EU fails to act, its credibility may be undermined. Retaliation against US.
Services could be the most effective card, but one Brussels is hesitant to play. Europe faces a historic challenge. The Trump tariffs aren't just taxes. They're political weapons aimed at undermining EU strength. The bloc must now decide: negotiate, retaliate, or transform. The path forward involves tough decisions and unprecedented unity. Can the EU withstand the pressure without fracturing? Can it leverage its power without igniting a global economic war? Only time will tell. But one thing is clear: the EU is no longer just reacting. It's preparing for a future where global trade is no longer based on rules, but on rivalry.